Hi, welcome to the Physionic Dedicated Podcast. Today, we've got a series of different topics that we're going to be talking about for this week. I'm changing the timing of when this releases, so this will have released on the video platforms, but will not have released on podcast platforms, or at least half of this content will have released on video platform. But with that said, who am I? My name is Nicholas Verhoeven. If you're not familiar with who I am, I have a master's in exercise physiology, ACSM certified personal trainer, and I am currently in my second year of my PhD in molecular medicine, so more molecular and cellular physiology and things of that nature. So I have a healthy respect, a healthy understanding of what the human body does and how I appreciate the human body and love learning about it. So what are going to be the topics that we're going to be talking about today? Just keep in mind, of course, as always, because this is going to be rather lengthy nowadays, I have timestamps if you want to skip to particular points in the podcast. But the first topic is how pets, this is kind of a lighthearted one, pets are associated with reduced incidence of schizophrenia. Pretty cool. The other one is understanding blood pH, and I think this is one that's going to hopefully help a lot of people, especially if you are one of those individuals that believes that we need to alkalinize our body. I'm going to explain why that's nonsensical in this podcast, explaining some of the biochemistry and the physiology that goes beyond that. And the other two topics are things that you may have already seen my content on, because I released just earlier this week, actually, I released content specifically on these two papers, these studies that I read. Those notes, the videos, the papers themselves are all available to you at this point that you're listening to this. So I encourage you to check those out in a more condensed format. But I will be going into more of the details on how they went about those studies and things of that nature. And these two studies are how all-nighters, or staying up all night, impact our food choice or our food selection, as well as how it impacts our brain and how our brain changes as a result. So really cool research. Is pretty simple paper, again, but I really appreciate it. It told some valuable information. So we're going to go into that a little bit. And then the other one is calorie deficit and lifespan. So I have already released the content for this, actually last week, but calorie deficit and lifespan, essentially how energy intake, or the amount that we consume, affects lifespan, or how long we end up living on this earth. Not talking about moving to Mars, literally how long we end up living in total. So I'm going to be covering all those topics right now. So let's jump into the first topic. And again, just as a reminder, all the timestamps are located so that you can check each one of them out for the one that or the few that you're most interested in. So the main topic for today, what I'm going to be talking about on Instagram and talking about on here, is the dogs associated with reduced incidence of schizophrenia. So what's really cool about this is that this was... this is a retrospective study, so essentially they looked back in time, and they used data that was already available, and they also collected more data in terms of just asking people, hey, have you had a pet? And then they compared that against a schizophrenic population. Of course, they figured out if those individuals had pets. And this is actually going to extend out further than just dogs as well. So if you're a cat lover, I have information for you too. So they looked at the relationship then between the incidence, or the number of people that have had a dog within the first 13 years of their life, which is a critical point, especially if you're talking about mental illness, but brain development in general, and certainly with schizophrenia, which is a pretty severe case of mental illness. And the reason for that, of course, is because you have a particular window within your brain develops massively. And then after that window, your brain still remodels and it still changes, and it can still, there's evidence that you can have neurogenesis and have new neurons and things of that nature. But for the most part, in terms of the majority of the growth of your brain and the maturity and the connections that occur within your brain, that's going to happen roughly within the first 25, 26 years of your life. And so they're looking at the first 13 years specifically, because you can imagine, literally just think about it. Just think about the amount of growth as a human being that occurs between the ages of 0 or right after 0 and 13 years. I mean, you're learning how to walk. You're learning how to talk. You're learning how to do all these crazy, crazy things. You go essentially from excuse the analogy, but like a worm to a functioning creature that's able to do incredible things. So with that, of course, the brain is one of the central units that allows, or the central unit that allows that to happen. So there's going to be a lot of growth during that period. So over 1,300 people were involved in this study. And again, it was all survey-based, so you're certainly only going to get associations out of this. And they showed that the exposure to a dog, like a pet, before the 13th birthday prompted reduced risk of schizophrenia by up to 24%. That's a pretty sizable amount, just to be exposed to an animal, to be exposed to a dog. And the greatest protection, so it's, like I said, it was up to 24%. The greatest protection was attributed to having a dog between the ages of 0 and 3. So they then broke it up across the different levels of age up to 13. And 0 to 3 was apparently the most effective and offered the greatest protection in that regard. Again, association. I don't want you to walk away with this thinking that dogs are the reason why people have or don't have schizophrenia. That's not the case. And then they postulated a few different reasons why that might be the case. And this is, they're going way out on a limb on this one, because they're already looking at associative data of literally a factor of another being just being around us, leading to this change in our brain, in our ability to fend off a mental illness, a severe mental illness. So take it with multiple grains of salt, so that that what you're consuming is literally salt to that degree. But I'm still going to report on it. So they postulated that it could be due to the canine microbiome. And we're getting more and more information on this, that if you're exposed to certain things, of course, that changes all kinds of different things in your body. And of course, we've known that changes your immune system massively. Your immune system will start remembering, in a manner of speaking, and that's why they call them memory B cells. But your immune system essentially remembers different pathogens, and even things that you don't physically, you never actually experienced, but you as in you consciously didn't experience it, but your body experienced it. So you're presented with all these different things, and your body's constantly adapting to those things to kind of integrate them into your immune system. So that's one thing that we've known about for a while, at least. But now we're getting more information on the microbiome. And I don't know if these authors, these researchers were just like, well, the microbiome's a hot topic right now, so we're just going to throw that into the paper. But it could be, it certainly could be that the microbiome of an animal is somehow being transferred, or it's having some sort of an impact on the body, if that's an intestinal microbiome, if that's a skin microbiome, whatever it might be, it could have an impact. So that's what they're postulating. If that's necessarily the truth, if that's what they don't show any actual data for that. So, your guess is essentially as good as theirs and mine. And another thing that they looked at was bipolar disorder, and they found that dogs did not have an association with reducing bipolar disorder. So dogs had an association with reducing schizophrenia, but did not have an association with decreasing bipolar disorder. Now, here's some bad news for the cat fans out there. I did mention I was going to talk about cats a little bit. They found no positive association, so no benefit, I should say, to having cats at any point in your life and reducing the risk of schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. So the only divergent effect, the only actual effect, the actual change in effect is from dogs, and specifically looking at schizophrenia. They looked at those two in isolation. So, if that helps with depression, I would imagine, this is me again spitballing, I would imagine that dogs and cats will have a positive impact, reduce the impact on cats, on depression. So I imagine that would have an impact, but who knows? But at least for this, cats had no positive impact. Sorry, cat fans. Okay, so that's essentially it. I will, of course, have this paper linked for you so you can look through it. I just skimmed over it. I didn't read into it in any sort of massive detail. It's just kind of a fun study. I think generally dogs are considered a pretty good animal to have around because of the fact that they boost your mood. They get you to go outside, walk around, meet people, socialize, take care of an animal, learn responsibility. All kinds of different things. So of course, this is just an added little bonus. It's not going to have any profound impact on your health. And again, like I said, in its association. So the next thing I wanted to talk about was understanding blood pH. Ooh, this is a tough one. All right, so let me drink some of my tea first. So a lot of people think that you need to eat certain foods to alkalinize your body. Well, here's the thing. As a physiologist, you start to learn, or if you just get into medicine, you start learning how the body functions. And the thing is, it's like there are gateways to different areas of your body. There are a lot of compartmentalizations that occur, even within a cell. So not even just within like our body, within various organ systems, but also, and even within an organ, but the cells themselves also have compartmentalization for specific reasons. There's good reason for that. But when it comes to blood, there's a difference between blood and the intestinal system. So there is compartmentalization between those two. So if you think of like food, if you're consuming a particular food and you think that has an alkaline property, it very well might. I'm not debating that. I'm not debating if a food has an alkaline property about it, that it will alkalinize. It's such a weird term to say. Alkalinize in a particular context, but the thing is that your body doesn't care. It's going to neutralize whatever charge is attributed to that food. So if you consume, let's say, a highly alkaline food, it goes straight into the pit of destruction known as your stomach. Your stomach is filled with hydrochloric acid. So it doesn't matter. That food is going to hit that hydrochloric acid and is going to immediately lose its charge because the hydrochloric acid is extremely potent, really, really low on the pH scale. I think like 1. I think it's like the lowest it can possibly be. And on top of that, your stomach can literally just secrete more of it. So unless you're constantly jamming the same food into your mouth 24/7, literally not sleeping and just consuming more of it. And let's be real, your stomach's just going to explode at that point. You're going to die. But let's put that aside for a second. Let's imagine you could. Your body is still just going to continue to use all the resources that you're putting into your mouth to just create more hydrochloric acid. And it's just going to keep producing it until it's neutralized all the stuff that you've put into your mouth. So right there, alkalizing your body is already neutralized. So, but let's just assume that that's not the case. There are still instances wherein your body can end up in an acidic situation or a more alkaline situation. And that's really what I want to talk about. Because once that food goes through its hydrochloric acid destruction in your stomach, it's called chyme, or however you pronounce it, CHYME, chyme. And then it goes into I believe the pyloric sphincter, I want to say, something like that. The pyloric gate, if you want to call, allows the separation, again, compartmentalization of the stomach with the small intestine, the duodenum specifically of the small intestine. And there, that the high acidity, because again, at this point, it's highly acidic. So you got to do something with that too. That high acidity of chyme, or that food that's been broken down, is then neutralized. So the body then pumps it with a bunch of neutralizing agents, a bunch of buffers. And that's a little bit like what I'm going to be talking about in the blood. And then that food gets absorbed and is sent into the bloodstream. So it's gone through two different processing systems where it's changed its pH dramatically. Like if the food was an alkaline level of 12, it dropped down to 1, and then it got brought back up to a normal level. So again, consuming alkaline foods because you're alkalinizing your food, your body, is nonsensical in that regard. But like I said, there are instances wherein your body will become more acidic or become more alkaline, more basic. And those situations are like strenuous exercise. So strenuous exercise will lead to the export of hydrogen ions. And when you're talking about higher acidity or lower acidity, you're talking about the levels of hydrogen ions. And as your body goes through metabolism, it ends up generating a lot of these hydrogen ions. And within the cell, your body will get rid of or neutralize these hydrogen ions, but also outside of the cell. So it'll export these hydrogen ions into the bloodstream, essentially, more or less. And there, it will also be neutralized. So how does that happen? Well, your body needs to maintain a blood pH of 7.4, so around neutral. Can fluctuate just a tiny bit lower, just a tiny bit higher. 7.35, 7.45, 7.4 being in the middle. And the way it's controlled is by a reaction called the carbonic anhydrase reaction. And the carbonic anhydrase reaction takes CO2, the same stuff that you're breathing out at this moment, unless you're a zombie, in which case it's pretty impressive that you're listening to this or watching this at the moment. But if you're breathing out CO2, mass amounts of CO2. And that CO2 has to come from somewhere. Believe it or not, this is one of those reactions. This is one of the critical reactions as to why we breathe CO2. One of the other ones is metabolism, going through the Krebs cycle, but I'm not going to be covering that. I'm going to be covering this reaction, again, the carbonic anhydrase reaction. So if you have too high of pH, let's say you're in an alkaline situation, then there's what happens is you have a combination of water plus CO2, because your body's majorly made up of water, plus CO2 to form H2CO3, which is called carbonic acid. It is carbonic acid. It is a weak acid. And then there it dissociates into bicarbonate plus hydrogen. And I already mentioned this, that hydrogen is really the driving factor for the increase in pH or lowering of pH. If you have lots of hydrogen in a set amount of space, you're going to have lower pH. It's going to be highly acidic. So lower pH. It's an inverse relationship in that regard. So high acidity, lower pH, inverse relationship in how you should think about it. But if you are more alkaline, that means you have lower amounts of hydrogen. So you just have less hydrogen around. So this reaction will go what's technically, I would assume is the reverse reaction, is we see this increase in pH by having this carbonic anhydrase reaction that occurs. And well, that's if you're in an alkaline situation, you want to decrease your pH. So that's going to allow the dissociation. I've got it wrong on my notes here. That's going to allow the dissociation of this bicarbonate, or if I backtrack again, water, CO2, then gets formed a carbonic acid, a weak acid, but it doesn't stay as carbonic acid. Then it dissociates to bicarbonate plus hydrogen, and that hydrogen will then lower the pH. That's what I'm talking about. Now, in an acidic situation, it's the exact opposite. So you're trying to remove hydrogens out of the bloodstream and convert them to the very end product, which is carbon dioxide, CO2. So in that situation, you're in an acidotic situation. You have lower pH than you should. So your body takes a combination, again, of the bicarbonate, and it clamps on these hydrogens, and it sucks them out of the blood pool, and then it forms carbonic acid. Again, we're here at this weak acid, and then from there, it then moves to water and carbon dioxide, essentially neutralizing, or I don't really want to say that word necessarily in this context because it ends up confusing things, but in essence, you are neutralizing. You're trying to get it back to a neutral pH of around 7.4. So then you have this buildup of CO2. So what happens? Well, you can imagine. I just said that, we're breathing out all this CO2. So what happens is your body starts ramping up breathing. You suddenly have to, you have a hard time catching a breath. You're breathing more quickly because you're eliminating more of those CO2. So that hydrogen goes through that entire reaction, ends up as CO2, and then gets pumped out. And then the water, of course, can be excreted, or it can stick around for a while, whatever needs to be done. Whatever your body needs to have done, it will do that, the most efficient thing that it possibly can. A lot of biochemical reactions that could occur. But CO2 does get pumped out by just breathing large amounts. So there you go. That's essentially it. And you're breathing, the speed of your breathing, and I guess I'll go back to an exact example, exercise, being under high intensity interval training, for example. You have this burning sensation in your musculature. A lot of those hydrogen ions get pumped out into your bloodstream. And then it goes through this reaction. And then you have a buildup of a lot of CO2 in your bloodstream. And what happens? You start breathing faster. But in all reality, you're probably breathing faster because your body needs more oxygen. So it's a two-way system there, which is freaking incredible. That's so cool that you're not only helping your body by bringing in all this oxygen so that you can generate energy and be able to fulfill the function that you're putting on it, but it's also exporting, if you want to call it detoxifying in a manner of speaking, exporting this excess CO2 so that they can continue channeling this reaction of getting rid of these hydrogen ions that are being produced by our metabolism during the exercise session, which is lowering our pH. So then this reaction occurs and we increase our pH back up like we should. So it's a two-way system, and there's more to it. There's certainly more to it. Your urinary system also jumps into your kidneys, renal system jump into this action as well, and a few other areas as well that can modulate the impact of this entire carbonic reaction. But hopefully it gives you some indication, some explanation as to why your body it's not in an acidic situation. In the worst scenarios, it's not in an acidic situation unless you can't breathe, or maybe if your kidneys aren't functioning. But those are pathological. Those are situations where you're probably in a hospital. This is not, even if you're eating McDonald's every single day, it's not great for you, certainly for other reasons, but you don't need to detoxify your body in this regard because of these complex, well, not really all that complex, but these really intricate, cool reactions that occur to make sure, because your body, and I had a podcast on this, you don't have to outthink your body. Your body is way better at fixing itself than you are at thinking about fixing it. In a pathological situation, that would be a situation where you'd want to go talk to a doctor, for example, and fix a specific issue, but that specific issue probably took decades of time to manifest, or if it's genetic, then, well, it's been around for your entire life. So without derailing too much, hopefully that offers some sort of explanation. Okay, so the next thing that I wanted to talk about is sleep. Specifically looking at sleep and its impact on food choices. So let me open up my notes here. So there's this study that looked at all-nighters, eliminating all sleep for an entire night, and then they did these brain scans on these individuals. And they wanted to know, okay, well, how is it going to impact their food choices? So let me tell you a little bit about this study. So the study was controlled and it was a crossover design, meaning that the individuals that got a full night's sleep one time, they were measured again. So they weren't looking at different people. They were looking at the same people at two different time points. So in one condition, participants were given the opportunity to sleep for 8 hours, and then they had, I believe, 7 days where they didn't sleep, where they slept normally for 7 days, where they were outside of the lab and they were instructed, hey, sleep normally, make sure that you stick to your daily routine, et cetera, et cetera. And then they came back to the lab, and then the researchers made sure that they stayed awake for 24 hours. And after each one, so after they slept for the full 8 hours, they were put in an MRI machine for an MRI scan of their brain, and then they were offered a bunch of pictures of different foods. And of course, these foods have different caloric contents, which I don't think that they were privy to know. But I mean, you let's be real. If you get shown a piece of cake compared to celery, I mean, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that the piece of cake is going to have a lot more calories. No doubt about that. But so I imagine that they had some reference of what was what. But these individuals were then given these images, and they were told, hey, can you rate these based on how much you want each food? And the food that you want the most, we will give you. So you will be able to eat it. So they were able to eat one of the foods, and that was the food that they found the most desirable. And during that time, they were taking brain scans to figure out what kind of changes occur. So after 24-hour sleep deprivation, these 23 young individuals, which was a mix of women and men, that abstained from drugs, alcohol, and caffeine for 3 days before the study started, they saw two dramatic changes. One of them was they looked at a variety of different specific areas in this general area, but the frontal cortex, which is, as I've mentioned in previous episodes, if you're watching the episode, it's in the front part of the brain. So by your forehead. And that area was dampened in its activity. And that area is known for rational thought, planning, things like that. So clearly that's going to have a pretty dramatic impact when it comes to choosing particular foods. But on top of that, the second thing that changed was that they had much higher levels of emotional excitability. So their emotional centers of their brain had greater activity with sleep deprivation. And this makes some sense if you kind of want to relate that to having a shorter fuse, having shorter temper, things like that. That would make some sense. You have less of the one side of the brain that's going to interject and be like, "Hey, calm down. This isn't that big a deal." If you think about it, it's not that big a deal. Trying to rationalize your way through life. So that part is out of the picture essentially, and the highly emotional part, the irrational part, is far more active. And so those were the two big changes in terms of the actual brain activity itself. And then they were shown, again, these images with showing based off of the expression of these particular areas of the brain. And the perceived hunger and the amount that they wanted each food was increased for the sleep-deprived individuals specifically. This is the interesting part. I've thought all of it's interesting, but this is definitely the interesting part. That the high-calorie foods were considered more desirable over the same individuals when they had full night's rest. So full night's sleep dampened their interest in high-calorie foods. But if they didn't get any sleep that night, their interest in high-calorie foods increased substantially, significantly. So there you go. I mean, that's already showing you that does not mean that individuals will eat more, because they didn't test that. It's just showing that there's an association between sleep deprivation and rating of hunger and interest in higher calorie foods. Now, again, this was not the case with the low calorie foods. They weren't craving more of the low calorie foods. It was specific to the high calorie foods, which makes things especially interesting, that they're attracted to higher calorie foods with sleep deprivation. So that is the first study that I wanted to talk about. And the other one is the calorie deficit and its impact on lifespan and extending a lifespan. So I'll touch on that in just a second. Let me take a sip of my tea with caffeine that I added. Okay. Let's finish this off. So this particular paper looked at mice, and reason why they had to look at mice is because you're not going to get a whole lot of volunteers. They're going to be like, sure, I will dedicate my entire life to this scientific project, wherein I will cut my calories drastically for my entire life. That's not going to happen. So they have to use a mammalian model. And in this situation, which was actually replicated, I believe, in monkeys as well. So this is not isolated to just this paper. Okay, so in this paper, it's pretty damn simple. They took mice and they had a few different conditions that they applied to these mice. They had mice that were allowed to eat as much as they wanted. They were given constant food and they weren't forced to eat, but they were allowed to eat as much as they wanted. And those mice ate a lot. Just by the weight chart that they show, there's massive increases in their weight. I mean, they're obese. That's how much we're talking. Then they had mice that were kind of the control condition, which is kind of a weird way to do a control, but it's somewhat understandable that they had a control condition where they fed these mice what would be a normal diet. So a normal amount. They certainly weren't starving, but they weren't allowed to eat incessantly, just nonstop. So those mice were fed a moderate protein, which was 20% of their diet was protein, and they were fed a controlled normal, quote unquote, normal calorie diet. And then they had 4 other conditions, and these are the actual caloric conditions, caloric restriction conditions. And these caloric restriction conditions are, well, if you check out the video, you can actually see the graphs and everything. But again, I'll have all this stuff linked so you can look up, look at my notes and whatnot in the actual study itself and look at the graphs. But one of the caloric conditions was a high protein, so 35% of its calories are protein, but it's a 40% restriction from normal. So 40% restriction from the control, which is what I was just talking about just now. So that's not a 40% restriction from the obese condition. That is different. Keep that in mind. I know I'm repeating myself, but I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page here. Then the other condition is the same, a 40% restriction with a 35%, so a high protein diet, 35% of calories coming from protein, but they also restricted them as babies, just to see if that had some sort of an impact, that if you reduce their calories from the get-go, from the moment they're born all the way for the rest of their lives, if that's going to have a positive or negative impact on their lifespan. And then they had a condition wherein it's the exact same. So they were restricted as adults, 40% restriction, but they were a low protein condition. Now, this is a specific low protein condition wherein they had from baby to 4 months to young adult, they consumed a high protein diet. So for the first 4 months of life, then they dropped down to 25%, then 20%, then down to a measly 15% until they died. So it's a kind of a gradual decrease in protein consumption. And the final condition is the most extreme caloric restriction. So all the other ones were 40% restriction, which is a lot. I mean, that's a lot of calories to restrict. This particular condition, this final condition, was a 52% restriction. So over half of the calories that they're supposed to be consuming in a day to kind of live a normal life, that's cut in half. So they just, for the rest of their lives, for the first 6 to 8 weeks as pups, as babies, they're fed normally, and then after that they're like, all right, here we go. You're eating half for the rest of your life. And there's some pretty interesting results when it came down to it. What they found is, and I'm only going to be reporting on the lifespan aspects. What they found is pretty interesting. So the calorie deficit does increase lifespan. They did show that. There was a 23% life extension with the 40% calorie deficit versus normal, versus the control. 23%. That's pretty massive. If you were to live 100 years normally, eating a normal diet, I'm definitely doing 100 years because I don't want to do 70 because doing the mental math and that is far too difficult for me. But 100 years, that means you live to be 123 if you do this caloric restriction. As always, if this translates to humans, well, I'll get to that, but don't take this as gospel. But just know that a caloric restriction leads to a longer lifespan based off this particular study. So 23% longer on 40%. Then 35% longer compared to obese. So the obese mice did not live very long, which is that's understandable. Let's be real. And so that's a 35% longer life with the 40% calorie restriction compared to obese. But what's interesting is that the greatest caloric restriction lived the longest. So they lived almost 40% longer. So about 4 to 5% longer than the other caloric restriction condition. So that is pretty interesting. So the more you calorically restrict, the longer you live, but you're calorically restricting yourself an extra 12% a day, and you're only getting an increase of 4 to 5% in your total lifespan. So you're going to be miserable, absolutely miserable, if you calorically restrict yourself by over half your calories every single day. Even if you live much longer, you're going to be living a miserable life for that extra time. So all that stuff is stuff that you should consider. So those were key factors. But on top of that, the protein differences, the low protein group did worse than the high protein group. Not by much. I don't have it written down exactly how much worse, but a few percentage points. We're not talking like years and years of extra life on a high protein diet. It was a pretty marginal in terms of the difference. So if they're roughly equivalent, that wouldn't be the worst thing in the world. So having a high protein diet certainly doesn't hurt, at least in this particular study. So so essentially we know that caloric restriction leads to longer lifespan. This study does not tell you anything about greater health span. So how good you feel, how mobile you are, how effective you are, how creative you are. All those different aspects and many more, go into your health span, not your lifespan. Your lifespan is literally just the number of years, how many total days you end up living. And caloric restriction does increase lifespan, which is really interesting. Now, I did say I was going to talk about if that applies to humans. My belief is that yes, it does apply to humans, even though we're looking at mice here. However, I don't believe that it's going to lead to a 20 to 35 to 40% increase in lifespan from caloric restriction. Not to mention, I absolutely believe, and I would even have hard evidence for this, that your health span will decrease. The quality of your life will be trash, but the length of your life will be at least noticeably longer. So take that as you will, but certainly don't believe that if you are just calorically restricting like 10, 15%, kind of a normal amount, 20%, for a few months that's suddenly going to increase your lifespan by 15% or something like that. That's not how this works. But if you would be one of those individuals that was just like, okay, that's it, I just want to live as long as possible, then calorically restricting yourself for the rest of your life would extend your life. But even though they didn't test this in this paper, my opinion would be that it will dramatically decrease your health span, the quality of your life throughout those extra years and leading up to those extra years. So there you have it. That's what I've got for you guys. I hope that you enjoyed this format in the podcast, longer format. Hopefully, if you did or didn't, I'd be happy to hear your feedback. I'm always open to criticism on how I can improve, as long as I get kind of a majority vote for people. If I sense that the majority of people want this kind of stuff, or one direction or another, then that's the way I go, because I'm trying to offer you guys the best possible information and the way that I present it as much as I possibly can. So this will release after Christmas for those of you that celebrate Christmas. But if you are celebrating Christmas, then Merry Christmas. And if for anybody else going through their celebrations at the end of the year, then happy holidays to you. And I hope that you have had and have a wonderful week. And I will speak with you. Hopefully, I hope I have the pleasure of speaking with you in the next one. Have a good one, guys. Goodbye.